Habakkuk moved through the crowded streets of Jerusalem, not because he wished to be among the people, but because the screaming compelled him forward. He did not look at the walls or the sky. His eyes were fixed on the circle of men forming near the marketplace. The sound of weeping cut through the noise of bartering and animal calls, a sharp, jagged sound that signaled loss. He pushed past a merchant who tried to block his path. Habakkuk was not a man of physical imposition, but the weight of his calling gave him a momentum that others instinctively yielded to. He broke through the line of spectators and saw the source of the commotion. A woman, draped in the rough garments of the poor, was on her knees. Her hands clutched the hem of a man's robe. The man was Eliakim, a minor official in the royal court of King Jehoiakim. Habakkuk knew him. Eliakim was known not for his wisdom, but for the heavy rings on his fingers and the cruelty in his smile. Behind Eliakim stood 2 guards, their hands resting casually on the hilts of their swords, indifferent to the woman's pleading. "Please," the woman cried, her voice cracking. "It is all I have left. The oil is for my sons. If you take it, we starve before the new moon." Eliakim did not look down at her. He was busy inspecting a clay jar his guard had seized. He tilted it, listening to the slosh of the oil inside. "The tax is due," Eliakim said, his voice bored. "The king requires his share, the temple requires its share, and the cost of collection must be paid." "I paid the tax," the woman screamed, scrambling to her feet, though the second guard shoved her back down instantly. "I paid it at the harvest. You are taking double. You are stealing." The crowd gasped, but no one stepped forward. To accuse a royal official was dangerous. To accuse him of theft was a death sentence. Habakkuk stepped into the open space. His heart hammered against his ribs, a familiar rhythm of fear and indignation. "She speaks the truth, Eliakim," Habakkuk said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the resonance of the priesthood, clear and cutting. Eliakim turned slowly. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the prophet. "Habakkuk," he sneered, "I might have known. Wherever there is a disturbance, you are there to preach." "The law of Moses is clear," Habakkuk said, stepping between the woman and the official. "You shall not oppress the widow or the fatherless. You shall not take a neighbor's cloak in pledge if they are poor. Return the jar. She has paid her due." Eliakim laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He signaled to his guard. The law is what the king says it is. And the king needs gold to pay the Egyptians. Or perhaps you would prefer the Pharaoh's army to return and burn this city? You use fear to mask your greed, Habakkuk countered, his hands trembling not from fear, but from a rage that felt like fire in his bones. You twist justice. The wicked surround the righteous, and so justice comes out perverted. Do you think the Lord does not see this? Eliakim stepped closer, invading Habakkuk's space. The official smelled of expensive wine and stale perfume. "Your Lord has been very quiet lately, prophet," Eliakim whispered, low enough that only Habakkuk could hear. "Look around you. The strong take what they want, the weak suffer, and the heavens stay silent. If your God cared about this widow, surely he would have struck me down by now." Eliakim snapped his fingers. The guard holding the clay jar smashed it onto the cobblestones. The precious oil shattered, soaking into the dust and dirt in seconds. The woman wailed, collapsing forward to try and scoop up the ruined oil with her bare hands, mixing it with her tears and the filth of the street. "A lesson," Eliakim announced to the watching crowd. "Do not waste the king's time." He turned and walked away, his guards trailing him, leaving the woman weeping in the mud. Habakkuk stood frozen. He wanted to shout, to call down fire, to see the earth open up and swallow the oppressor, but nothing happened. Your support gives a voice to the voiceless, echoing the cry of the prophets. Hit like and subscribe to help us break the silence that history often keeps. And stay with us, because the answer Habakkuk receives is not a comfort, it is a terror you won't believe. The sun continued to beat down. The crowd began to disperse, eyes averted, afraid to be associated with the tragedy. Habakkuk knelt beside the woman. He placed a hand on her shoulder, but she flinched away, her eyes hollow. She did not want his comfort. She wanted justice. She wanted bread for her children. And Habakkuk, the man of God, had nothing to give her but words that suddenly felt empty. He stood up. The taste of bile was in his throat. He looked at the spilled oil, dark against the pale dust. It looked like blood. This was not just a crime. It was a symptom of a rotting body. Judah was dying from the inside. He turned from the marketplace and began to walk. He did not go to the temple. He could not bear to see the priests going through the motions of sacrifice, while the city devoured its own people. He headed for the lower city, walking faster and faster until he was running, fleeing the scene of the crime, fleeing the silence of the outcome. The questions he had suppressed for months began to claw at his throat. The oracle, the burden, was no longer something he could carry silently. It was crushing him. He needed an answer, or he felt he would die. Habakkuk slammed the heavy wooden door of his dwelling behind him and slid the bolt into place. He was alone, but the room felt crowded with the ghosts of everything he had seen that day. The weeping of the widow echoed off the stone walls. The sneer of Elikim hung in the air. He paced the length of the room. 3 steps forward, turn. 3 steps back, turn. His breathing was ragged. He tore the scarf from his head and threw it onto the floor. How long? The words ripped out of him, harsh and guttural. He was not kneeling. He was not bowing his head in reverence. He was standing in the center of the room, looking up at the ceiling beams as if he could stare through them into the throne room of heaven. How long, Lord, must I call for help? But you do not listen. He waited. He listened. Outside, the sounds of the city continued. A dog barking, a cart rolling over stones, a distant shout of revelry. But from God, nothing. Habakkuk kicked a stool across the room. It clattered against the wall, overturning. The violence of the action startled him, but he did not stop. He was past the point of polite ritual. Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save, he shouted, his voice rising. Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? He squeezed his eyes shut, and the images flooded his mind. It was not just the widow today. It was the bribe he saw the judge take last week. It was the false prophet lying in the king's court yesterday, promising peace when there was no peace. It was the idols being set up in secret chambers. Destruction and violence were before him. Strife was everywhere. Conflict abounded. He resumed his pacing, his hands forming into fists. The law is paralyzed, he argued, speaking to the empty air as if God were standing in the corner, refusing to act. Justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. He stopped and leaned against the cold stone wall, pressing his forehead against it. The heat of his anger was turning into the cold ache of despair. This was the worst fear of a prophet, not that God would speak wrath, but that God would not speak at all, that God had packed up his presence and left Judah to rot. Are you indifferent? Habakkuk whispered now, his voice hoarse. Did you not lead us out of Egypt? Did you not part the sea? Why are you silent now? Elikim mocks you to my face, and you do nothing. They crush the poor, and you watch. Are you watching? He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He felt like a child who had been locked out of his father's house. The spiritual decay of his nation was a physical weight on his chest, making it hard to draw breath. He remembered the teachings. Wait on the Lord. Trust in his timing. But the time was up. Innocent people were dying. The covenant was being trampled. If God was holy, how could he stand this? I am not asking for blessings, Habakkuk said, speaking into his hands. I am not asking for rain or harvest. I am asking for you to be who you said you are. You are the judge. So judge, do something. The silence stretched. 1 minute, 10 minutes, an hour. Habakkuk remained on the floor, his energy spent. The adrenaline of his anger faded, leaving behind a deep, hollow exhaustion. He had thrown his accusations at the Almighty. He had called God out. By all rights, he should be struck dead for his insolence. But the silence persisted. It was a thick, heavy silence. It was not peace. It was tension. Then he felt it. Not a voice in his ear, but a shift in the atmosphere. The air in the room seemed to grow denser, charged with an electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, not from the setting sun, but from a presence that was heavier than light. Habakkuk lifted his head. His heart began to race again, but this time it was not with anger. It was with awe. Look at the nations and watch. A voice resonated. Habakkuk scrambled back, pressing himself against the wall. The voice did not come from a specific direction. It vibrated in his very bones. It was the sound of rushing waters, the sound of tectonic plates shifting. "And be utterly amazed," the voice continued, "for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told." Habakkuk tried to speak, but his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. God was speaking. The silence was broken, but the tone was not comforting. It was not the gentle whisper that Elijah heard. It was the rumble of a gathering storm. "I am raising up the Babylonians," the voice declared. Habakkuk's breath hitched. The Babylonians, the Chaldeans. The name alone was enough to freeze the blood of any man in the Near East. They were savages, a war machine that was swallowing the world. That ruthless and impetuous people, the divine voice continued, relentless, who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Habakkuk listened in horror as the description unfolded. God described their horses as swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. He described their cavalry galloping headlong, flying like an eagle swooping to devour. "They all come intent on violence," God said. "Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them." The vision filled Habakkuk's mind. He saw the dust clouds of an army that had no end. He saw the fires. He saw the very thing he had asked for, judgment coming in a form he could never have imagined. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on guilty men, whose own strength is their God. The presence in the room receded, leaving Habakkuk gasping for air. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of a nightmare. Habakkuk sat paralyzed. He had asked God to deal with the corruption in Judah. He had asked God to stop men like Eliakim, and God had answered. He was sending a hurricane to blow out a candle. He was sending a pack of wolves to discipline a stray sheep. "Babylon," Habakkuk whispered the word into the darkness. It made no sense. It was impossible. How could a holy God use a nation that worshipped their own military might to judge his chosen people? It was a cure far worse than the disease. Habakkuk stood up, his legs shaking. The confrontation was not over. It had only just begun. He had wrestled for an answer, and the answer had terrified him more than the silence ever could. He reached for his cloak. He could not stay in this room. He needed to find higher ground. He needed to understand. He unbolted the door and stepped out into the night. The city of Jerusalem lay before him, sleeping in ignorance. They did not know what was coming. They did not hear the hoofbeats in the distance. But Habakkuk heard them, and he knew with a sinking dread that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun did not bring warmth to Habakkuk. It only brought visibility to the decay he now knew was marked for destruction. He walked through the upper gate of the temple, his robe heavy with the sweat of a sleepless night. The divine voice from the darkness had ceased, but the echo of the word Babylon rattled in his skull like a stone in a dry jar. He needed to find the others. There were few left in Jerusalem who still trembled at the law of Moses, a small remnant who met in hushed tones behind closed doors. Habakkuk needed to see faces that held the same fear he felt. He found them in the courtyard of the archive chamber, 3 elders and a young scribe named Baruch. They stood in a tight circle, speaking in whispers. When they saw the prophet approaching, their conversation died. They saw the pallor of his skin and the wildness in his eyes. "You have heard from him," the eldest, a man named Shaphan, stated. It was not a question. Habakkuk nodded. He stepped into their circle, his hands gripping the sleeve of Shaphan's tunic. "I cried out," Habakkuk rasped. "I demanded justice. I asked why he stands idle while the law is paralyzed." "And?" Baruch asked, leaning in, a quill still stained with ink clutched in his hand. "Does he bring deliverance? Will he strike down the corrupt officials?" Habakkuk looked at them. These were good men. They prayed for revival. They believed that if they were faithful enough, God would restore the glory of the kingdom. To tell them the truth felt like striking a child. "He is moving," Habakkuk said, choosing his words with agonizing care. "He told me to watch the nations. He said he is doing a work in our days that we would not believe, even if told." "A miracle," one of the other elders breathed, clasping his hands. "He will send confusion into the camps of our enemies. He will restore the righteous judges." "No," Habakkuk said. The word fell like a hammer. not a miracle of salvation, a work of judgment. He is raising up the Chaldeans. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the silence of the night. The men stared at him. The Chaldeans, the Babylonians, were not a tool of correction. They were an engine of annihilation. "You are mistaken," Shaphan said, his voice trembling. "The Chaldeans are pagans. They worship strength and wood and stone. Yahweh would not use the unclean to cleanse his temple. That is theologically impossible." "I heard the voice," Habakkuk insisted, his voice rising, drawing the attention of a passing priest who glared at them. Habakkuk lowered his voice to a fierce whisper. He described them, ruthless, impetuous. He said they sweep across the earth like the desert wind. He said they mock kings. "Then we must repent," Baruch said, his eyes wide. "If we call a fast, if we tear our robes." "It is already decided," Habakkuk cut him off. The finality of the message burned him. He spoke of them as a wave that has already crested. You do not stop a wave by asking it to be water. Shaphan pulled his arm away from Habakkuk's grip. He stepped back, a look of betrayal on his face. "You interpret your own fear as the voice of God, prophet. God protects his covenant. He punished us before, yes, but he does not hand his heritage over to the beast. You have not slept. Go home. Rest." The elders turned away. They could not accept it. It shattered the framework of their world. They walked back toward the safety of the scrolls, leaving Habakkuk standing alone in the stone courtyard. He watched them go, realizing the terrified isolation of his position. He was the only man in Jerusalem who knew the sky was falling, yet everyone around him was arguing about the weather. He turned and walked out into the city streets. He saw a merchant cheating a customer with false weights. He saw a wealthy landowner striking a servant across the face. Yesterday, these sights filled him with rage. Today, they filled him with a sickly sense of doom. He looked at the merchant and saw a dead man. He looked at the landowner and saw a prisoner of war. "You fools," he whispered to the bustling street. "You build houses on the edge of a volcano." He passed the royal palace. Guards stood at the gates, polishing their bronze shields. They looked confident, arrogant in their strength. Habakkuk remembered the voice. They laugh at all fortified cities. These shields would be paper against the Babylonian cavalry. A sudden commotion at the city gate drew his attention. A group of travelers had arrived, dust-covered and frantic. Habakkuk moved toward them, compelled by a sinking feeling in his gut. The silence of God was over, but the silence of the people was about to be broken by a scream. The travelers were merchants from the north, men accustomed to the hardships of the road, but they looked as though they had seen a ghost. A crowd gathered quickly, eager for news from the trade routes, hoping for talk of profits or spices. Instead, they got terror. Habakkuk pushed to the front of the assembly. The lead merchant was drinking water from a skin offered by a bystander, his hands shaking so badly the water spilled down his beard. "Tell us," a voice from the crowd shouted. "Is it bandits? Is it the Egyptians?" The merchant wiped his mouth and looked at the crowd with haunted eyes. "Tyre is anxious," he said, his voice raspy. "Damascus is trembling. They are coming." "Who?" someone demanded. "The Chaldeans," the merchant said. "I saw the smoke from the ridges of Carchemish. They do not fight like men. They fight like a swarm of locusts." Habakkuk felt the blood drain from his face. The vision was manifesting. It was no longer a spiritual abstraction. It was geography. It was happening. "They move faster than leopards," the merchant continued, and Habakkuk gasped. It was the exact phrase God had used. "Their horses, they are sharper than wolves in the evening. They do not stop for spoil. They fly like eagles to the carcass." The crowd murmured. Some laughed nervously. "Merchants always exaggerate," a man next to Habakkuk muttered. "He wants to drive up the price of his grain by claiming danger." "I tell you," the merchant shouted, hearing the doubt, "they gather captives like sand. I saw a fortress, a high tower, near Hamath. They did not besiege it for months. They built a ramp of earth in 3 days and swarmed over the walls. They laughed. They laughed at the kings who tried to bribe them." Habakkuk stepped forward. "Did they speak of a god?" he asked. The merchant looked at Habakkuk. "They say their strength is their god. They worship their own swords. They have no fear of the heavens." The crowd began to fracture. Arguments broke out. Some called for the king to strengthen the garrison. Others dismissed the threat, claiming Egypt would protect them as part of their alliance. Habakkuk looked at the faces around him. Denial, anger, bargaining, but no repentance. No one fell to their knees. No one asked why this was happening. Eliakim, the official from the marketplace, pushed his way through the throng. He was flanked by 4 guards this time. "Disperse," Eliakim ordered. "This man spreads panic. The king has received assurances from Pharaoh. The Babylonians are merely skirmishing in the north. They will not cross the river. Jerusalem is the city of David. It is impregnable. They mock fortified cities," Habakkuk shouted. He could not stop himself. The words erupted from him. "Eliakim, your walls are nothing to them. They heap up earth and take them. This is not a skirmish. It is a judgment." Eliakim turned his cold gaze on Habakkuk. "You again, the mad prophet. Do you wish to join the dungeon for treason? To speak against the safety of the king is to speak against God. God is the one raising them up," Habakkuk countered, pointing a trembling finger at the horizon. "I saw it. I heard it. You rely on Egypt, but Egypt is a broken reed. You rely on walls, but the walls will crumble. The Chaldeans are the hammer in the hand of Yahweh." The crowd fell silent, looking between the official and the prophet. For a moment, the fear in the merchant's eyes seemed to weigh more than the gold on Eliakim's neck. Eliakim stepped close to Habakkuk. "If you speak of this again," he hissed, "I will have your tongue cut out. We need order, not hysteria." Eliakim shoved Habakkuk backward and ordered his guards to clear the square. The merchant was dragged away for questioning by the royal guard. The people scattered, heads down, choosing the comfort of Eliakim's lie over the terror of Habakkuk's truth. Habakkuk stumbled away, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He found himself walking toward the Kidron Valley, away from the noise, away from the blindness. He reached a grove of olive trees and collapsed against a gnarled trunk. The physical reality of the prophecy was far worse than the vision. Hearing the merchant confirm the words, "horses like leopards, gathering captives like sand," made it nauseatingly real. He looked up at the sky. It was blue and vast, indifferent to the panic below. "Why?" Habakkuk asked again. But this time, the question was different. It was not asking why God was silent. It was asking why God was this God. "You are of purer eyes than to behold evil," Habakkuk argued, his mind racing, constructing the case he would bring for his second complaint. "You cannot look on wickedness with favor. So why do you look on when the treacherous deal falsely?" He picked up a handful of dirt and let it slip through his fingers. "Why are you silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he?" Judah was bad. Eliakim was corrupt. The king was weak. But Babylon was a monster. Babylon was a beast that devoured nations for sport. How could a holy God use a filthy instrument to cleanse his house? It was a theological scandal. "You make mankind like the fish of the sea." Habakkuk wept, the image of the net filling his mind, like creeping things that have no ruler. "The Chaldean brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net, and then he sacrifices to his net because by it he lives in luxury." Habakkuk stood up. The shock had passed, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. He would not accept this. He would not just sit and die. If God was going to dismantle the world, Habakkuk was going to demand an explanation that made sense. He looked toward the high ground, toward the watchtower that overlooked the valley. "I will not be silenced by officials," Habakkuk declared to the wind, "and I will not be silenced by my own fear. I will stand my watch. I will set myself on the rampart." He began the climb. It was a steep path, rocky and treacherous, but he did not slow down. He was going to station himself there. He would watch to see what God would say to him. He would wait for the reproof. He would wait for the logic that could explain the death of a nation. The sun began to set, casting long, blood-red shadows across the valley. Habakkuk climbed, a solitary figure against the darkening sky, carrying a burden that felt heavier than the stones beneath his feet. He was ascending to the Court of Appeals, and he was not coming down until he had a verdict he could live with. Habakkuk did not immediately ascend the tower. The weight of the revelation pinned him to the earth, forcing him to navigate the winding alleys of the lower city where the shadows were deepest. He needed confirmation, not of the prophecy, but of the reality that was already clawing at the borders of Judah. He found his way to a cramped, subterranean tavern frequented by mercenaries and travelers who wished to remain unseen. The air was thick with the smell of sour wine and unwashed bodies. Habakkuk pulled his hood low, but he was not looking to hide. He was hunting for a specific kind of fear. He spotted a man in the corner, slumped over a wooden table. The man wore the remnants of a tunic that bore the dust of the northern roads, and his right hand was wrapped in a bloody bandage. He was shaking, though the room was warm. Habakkuk slid onto the bench opposite the stranger. The man flinched, his hand dropping to a dagger at his belt. "Peace," Habakkuk said, keeping his hands visible. "I seek only news from the north." The man laughed, a ragged, broken sound. "There is no north," he whispered. "Not anymore. Carchemish is gone. Hamath is burning." "Tell me of them," Habakkuk pressed. "The Chaldeans." The soldier leaned in, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "They are not men. I fought the Assyrians years ago. They were cruel, yes, but the Babylonians, they are a machine. They do not just defeat an army, they erase it." The soldier grabbed Habakkuk's wrist with his uninjured hand. His grip was like iron. "We were stationed at a border outpost, 50 men, strong walls. We thought we could hold them off for a week. They arrived at dawn. By midday, they had built a ramp of earth higher than our walls. They did not shout, they did not beat drums. They just worked, like ants, swarming over everything." "And the captives?" Habakkuk asked, dread pooling in his stomach. "There were no captives at first," the soldier hissed. "They killed the commanders. Then they took the rest of us. They laughed at us. They made us bow to their standards, poles topped with golden images of strange beasts. They told us that their swords were their gods. They said that any god who could not stop their blade was no god at all." Habakkuk felt the blood drain from his face. It matched the voice he had heard in the vision. "Guilty men whose own strength is their god. I escaped during the night," the soldier continued, his voice dropping to a trembling murmur. "I hid in a ravine. I watched them move on. They are coming here, stranger. They asked the prisoners about Jerusalem. They asked about the gold in the temple. They are hungry, and they are never full." Suddenly, the tavern door burst open. 3 royal guards strode in, the crest of King Jehoiakim gleaming on their breastplates. "You," the lead guard shouted, pointing at the soldier, "deserter! You spread lies of defeat to weaken the king's morale." The soldier scrambled back, overturning the bench. "It is the truth. They are coming." The guards did not listen. They seized the man, dragging him toward the door. He screamed, kicking and thrashing. "You cannot fight them. You must run. They are the wind. They are death." Habakkuk stood up, intending to intervene, but the lead guard turned his spear toward the prophet. "Sit down, priest, unless you wish to be branded a traitor as well." Habakkuk watched helplessly as they dragged the man out into the night. The tavern went silent. No one moved. No one spoke. They all knew what would happen to the deserter. He would be silenced, his warning buried in a dungeon, while the city slept on, believing the lie of safety. Habakkuk left the tavern, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The horror was not just the violence of the enemy, it was the inevitability of it. God was not merely allowing this, he was orchestrating it. He was whistling for the Babylonians as a shepherd whistles for his dogs. He walked through the sleeping city, passing houses where families slept in peace, unaware that a net was being cast over them. He felt a wave of nausea. This was the divine answer. To stop the oppression of the poor in Judah, God was bringing an army that would devour both the oppressor and the poor alike. He stopped by the wall of a rich man's vineyard. Inside, he could hear the faint sound of music and laughter. They were feasting. They were drinking wine from bowls, unaware that the winepress of wrath was being trodden outside their gates. The internal conflict within Habakkuk shifted. It was no longer about why God was inactive. It was about why God was so terrifyingly active. The cure seemed infinitely worse than the disease. How could the Holy One of Israel employ a nation that worshipped violence to punish a nation that had simply forgotten its way? He looked at his hands. They were trembling. He needed to speak to God again, but this time he would not come as a beggar asking for help. He would come as a lawyer bringing a case against the judge himself. He turned his face toward the dark outline of the watchtower rising against the stars. The time for listening was over. The time for the second argument had begun. Habakkuk reached the base of the watchtower just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky. The climb was steep, forcing him to use his hands to pull himself up the rough-hewn stones. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, but his mind was sharpening with every step. He reached the platform at the top. The wind whipped at his robes, cold and biting. Below him, the Kidron Valley was a ribbon of shadow. Above him, the heavens were silent and vast. He paced the small stone platform. He did not fall to his knees. He stood tall, looking out toward the north, toward the invisible approaching storm. "Majestic One," Habakkuk began, his voice steady despite the wind. "Holy One, my rock, you do not die, you are eternal." He was establishing the premise, laying the foundation of his argument. He knew who God was, or at least, he thought he did. "You ordained them for judgment," Habakkuk shouted, gesturing toward the north. "You established them for correction. I accept this. I heard your voice." Then he paused, his brow furrowing. He gripped the stone parapet until his knuckles turned white. "But your eyes are too pure to look on evil," he cried out. "You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. You cannot stand to watch treachery. That is what the law teaches. That is what the prophets before me declared." He slammed his hand against the stone. "Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves?" This was the crux of the absurdity. Yes, Judah was sinful. Yes, Elikim was a thief. But the Babylonians, they were monsters. Compared to Babylon, even the corrupt leaders of Jerusalem were saints. "Judah has forgotten you," Habakkuk argued to the wind. "But Babylon mocks you. They worship their own nets. They burn incense to their own dragnet. How does this serve justice? You are using a wolf to discipline a wayward sheep, but the wolf does not discipline. The wolf devours." He began to act out the metaphor that had seized his mind. He mimed casting a net over the city below. "You have made mankind like the fish of the sea," he accused. "Like sea creatures that have no ruler. We are helpless. We have no king who can stand against this. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them in his dragnet." Habakkuk saw the faces of the people he had tried to defend. The widow in the market, the faithful remnant hiding in the archives, the children playing in the streets. "And he catches them all," Habakkuk screamed. "Not just the wicked. Your judgment is a blunt instrument, Lord. It destroys the innocent with the guilty. The Babylonian does not sort the fish. He kills them all. He rejoices and is glad. He sacrifices to his net because by it he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food." Tears streamed down his face now, hot and angry. "Is he to keep on emptying his net?" Habakkuk demanded. "Is he to go on destroying nations without mercy? Will you let him eat the world?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The sun broke over the horizon, bathing the city in a golden light that felt like a lie. The beauty of the morning stood in stark contrast to the horror of the future. Habakkuk felt the exhaustion of his spiritual wrestling. He had pushed his theology to its breaking point. If God was sovereign, then God was responsible for the rise of this evil. If God was holy, then he could not abide this evil. The contradiction tore at Habakkuk's soul. He slumped against the wall of the watchtower, sliding down until he sat on the cold stone. He had presented his case. He had pointed out the moral inconsistency. He had challenged the Almighty on the grounds of his own character. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait. "I will stand at my watch," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I will station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me." He pulled his knees to his chest. "I will wait to see what answer I am to give to this complaint." He closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. He listened. He listened to the wind, to the waking city, to the beat of his own heart. He knew that the answer, when it came, would determine whether his faith would survive or shatter. He was no longer just a prophet warning a nation. He was a man demanding that the universe make moral sense. The day passed slowly. The sun climbed to its zenith and began to fall. Habakkuk did not move. He did not eat. He became part of the stone, a sentinel of doubt and expectation. He knew that God was not obligated to answer him. God could strike him down with lightning. God could ignore him. But Habakkuk also knew, with a deep, primal instinct, that God liked to fight. God did not want the silent submission of a slave. He wanted the honest wrestling of a son. And so Habakkuk waited, suspended between the silence of heaven and the noise of the earth, holding his ground on the high tower. While Habakkuk wrestled with the silence of heaven, Jerusalem drowned itself in noise. King Jehoiakim had ordered a festival to celebrate the alliance with Egypt. The lower city was alive with the sound of tambourines and lyres, a frantic, desperate joy manufactured to drown out the rumors drifting down from the north. Habakkuk descended from the quiet of the hills and entered the temple courtyard. It was packed with bodies. The smell of roasting meat sacrifices offered with unclean hands hung heavy in the air, clashing with the scent of heavy perfume worn by the nobility. In the center of the court of the priests, a man stood on a raised wooden platform. It was Hananiah, a prophet who wore the fine linen of the court and smiled with the confidence of a man who dined at the king's table. He held his hands up, silencing the crowd. "People of Judah," Hananiah bellowed, his voice smooth as oil, "do not listen to the mongers of doom. Do not listen to those who whisper in the shadows about armies and destruction." The crowd cheered. They wanted to believe him. They needed to believe him. "I have dreamed a dream," Hananiah shouted, pacing the platform. "The Lord spoke to me in the night, and he said, 'I have broken the yoke of the king of Babylon.'" A roar of approval went up. Men hugged their wives. Soldiers clashed their spears against their shields. "Within 2 years," Hananiah promised, pointing a finger toward the sky, "the vessels of the Lord's house that were taken will be returned. The exiles will return. There will be peace. Peace in our borders, peace in our homes. Babylon is a passing storm, and the son of Judah is rising." Habakkuk felt a fire ignite in his chest that was hotter than the altar flames. This was not just a lie. It was a sedative administered to a dying man. It was spiritual malpractice. He pushed his way through the crowd. He was not wearing fine linen. His tunic was torn from his earlier grieving, and his face was gaunt from fasting. He looked like a specter haunting the feast. "Liar!" Habakkuk shouted. The cheer died in an instant. The crowd parted, creating a corridor between the ragged prophet and the court favorite. Hananiah looked down, his smile tightening. "Ah, Habakkuk, the man who sees only darkness. Come to spoil the king's celebration? You speak of peace when there is no peace," Habakkuk yelled, his voice cracking with intensity. "You treat the wound of this people as if it were a scratch. You say peace, peace, but the sword is already at the throat. The Lord protects his own," Hananiah countered smoothly, playing to the crowd. "Are we not the children of the covenant? Is this not the temple of Solomon? God will not allow the uncircumcised to triumph over us." "God is not a tame lion that you can keep in a cage," Habakkuk retorted, stepping onto the first step of the platform. "You trust in the temple, but you trample the laws of the temple. You steal, you murder, you commit adultery, and then you come and stand before this house and say, 'We are safe to do all these detestable things'?" Eliakim, the official, stepped out from the shadow of a pillar, whispering something to Hananiah. Hananiah laughed. "Habakkuk thinks the Lord is angry, but look around. The harvest was plentiful. The Egyptians are our friends. These are signs of favor, not judgment. The Babylonian cavalry does not care about your harvest." Habakkuk screamed, desperation clawing at him. "They are a law unto themselves. They are coming to thresh this nation like grain. And you lull these people to sleep so they will not run when the wolf comes." Hananiah's face grew cold. He leaned down. "And what is your word, Habakkuk? What does your God say? Does he offer hope or just death?" "He offers truth," Habakkuk said, "however bitter it is. Judgment is coming. It is not a possibility. It is a decree. Take him away." Hananiah dismissed him with a wave of his hand. "He is mad with jealousy. He hates that the king does not consult him." 2 temple guards seized Habakkuk by the arms. He did not fight them. He looked into the faces of the crowd, the tanner, the baker, the mother holding her child. He saw hope in their eyes. But it was a false hope, a brittle glass that would shatter at the first strike of a Babylonian sword. "You are drinking poison," Habakkuk shouted as he was dragged toward the gate of Coponius. "Wake up!" The watchman has blown the trumpet. Why do you not hear?" They threw him out of the temple precincts into the dusty street. The heavy bronze gates slammed shut with a finality that shook the ground. Inside, the music started up again, louder than before, desperate to cover the memory of his voice. Habakkuk lay in the dirt for a long moment. He realized then that he could not save them. They did not want to be saved, they wanted to be soothed. He stood up, dusting off his robe. There was only one place left to go. He turned his back on the city of lies and faced the tower on the ridge. The climb was not a metaphor. It was a grueling physical ascent up the limestone ridge that overlooked the Kidron Valley. The watchtower was an old structure, built generations ago to spot approaching raiders from the desert, now largely abandoned by a kingdom that felt secure in its alliances. Habakkuk climbed alone. The path was steep and littered with loose shale that slipped under his sandals, threatening to send him sliding back down. His legs burned with exertion. His throat was parched, but he did not stop to drink from the water skin slung over his shoulder. He needed the exhaustion. He needed the physical struggle to quiet the chaos in his mind. With every step, he shed the noise of the city. He shed the arguments of Hananiah. He shed the mocking laughter of Elikim. He reached the base of the tower as the sun began to dip below the western hills. The structure was cylindrical, built of rough-hewn field stones, with a narrow wooden ladder leading to the upper platform. Habakkuk climbed the ladder and pulled himself onto the wooden deck. It was exposed to the elements, a small circle of solitude suspended between earth and sky. The wind here was constant, a relentless, invisible force that tugged at his beard and clothes. "I will stand at my watch," he said aloud, the words snatched away by the breeze. He paced the small circumference of the platform. He checked the horizon, nothing but the darkening purple of twilight. He checked the city below, a cluster of flickering lamps, small and fragile against the vastness of the night. He sat down, wrapping his cloak tight around him against the chill. This was the waiting. This was the hardest part of the prophetic office. It was not the speaking, it was the listening. It was the terrible, stretching silence between the question and the answer. Hours passed. The moon rose, a pale sliver that offered little light. Habakkuk's stomach growled, cramping with hunger, but he ignored it. He focused his entire being on his spiritual hearing. "Why do you allow the treacherous to win?" The question replayed in his mind, but he did not speak it again. He had already filed his complaint. Now he was waiting for the verdict. Doubt began to creep in. Had he imagined the first voice? Was Hananiah right? Perhaps he was just a bitter man projecting his own unhappiness onto the heavens. Perhaps Babylon would never come. Perhaps he would die up here, a fool on a tower, waiting for a God who had nothing left to say. He shivered. The cold seeped into his bones. His resolve wavered. He could go down. He could apologize to the king. He could live a quiet life, ignore the injustice, and eat the bread of compromise. "No," he whispered, gripping the rough wood of the floorboards. "I know what I saw. I know what I heard." He forced himself to stand up again, to keep the blood moving. He looked north. The darkness there felt heavy, pregnant with the threat he knew was real. "I am here, Lord," he said, into the night. "I am not leaving. If you slay me, I will still wait. If the Babylonians come tomorrow and take my head, I will be found standing here, looking for you." The night deepened. The stars wheeled overhead in their slow, indifferent dance. Habakkuk felt his consciousness slipping into a trance-like state, suspended between wakefulness and dreams. He was no longer just a man on a tower. He was a nerve ending of the nation, exposed and raw, waiting for the touch of the divine. He did not know how long he stood there. It might have been hours, it might have been a lifetime. But then, just as the darkness seemed absolute, a clarity washed over him. It was not a sound. It was a sharpening of vision, a sudden expansion of understanding. The wind seemed to stop. The world held its breath. He was ready. The answer did not come as thunder this time. It came as a command, clear and precise, cutting through the fog of Habakkuk's fatigue. "Right." Habakkuk jolted, his eyes snapping open. The sky was lightening in the east, a bruise of gray turning to lavender. The presence of the Lord was on the tower with him, not as a terrifying warrior, but as a master architect unfurling a blueprint. "Write the vision," the voice said, resonating in his chest. "Make it plain on tablets, so he may run, Who reads it? Habakkuk scrambled for the stylus and the small scroll of parchment he kept in his belt. His hands shook, but he steadied them against the parapet. This was practical. This was instruction. God was not ignoring the complaint. He was formalizing the response. "For the vision is yet for an appointed time," the voice continued, the tone shifting from command to assurance, "but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry." Habakkuk scratched the words onto the parchment. The sound of the stylus loud in the morning air. He understood now. The delay was not denial. The timeline of heaven did not match the timeline of Jerusalem. The judgment of Babylon was locked in, a fixed point in the future that was rushing toward them, unstoppable. But then, the voice shifted. God began to address the core of Habakkuk's second question, the moral absurdity of using the wicked Babylonians. "Behold the proud," God said, and Habakkuk knew he was speaking of the Chaldeans. "His soul is not upright in him." God saw them. He saw their arrogance. He saw their violence. He was not blind to the nature of the instrument he was using. He knew they were puffed up, swollen with their own vanity. And then came the sentence that changed everything. The sentence that bridged the gap between the chaotic present and the eternal future. "But the just shall live by his faith." Habakkuk stopped writing. He stared at the words. "The just shall live by his faith." It was the pivot point of history. The Babylonians lived by their swords. The corrupt leaders of Judah lived by their greed. But the righteous remnant, they were not promised safety. They were not promised wealth. They were promised life, sustained not by bread or walls, but by their faithfulness to God in the dark. The answer was not that God would stop Babylon. The answer was that the righteous man would survive the era of Babylon by holding fast to God. Faith was not an escape route. It was a survival mechanism. "Do not look at the waves." The understanding flooded Habakkuk's mind. "Look at the rock," God continued, pouring out the judgment upon the very instrument he was using. He began to pronounce woes upon the Babylonians, dismantling their glory piece by piece. "Woe to him who increases that which is not his," the voice proclaimed. "How long? And to him who loads himself with thick clay." Habakkuk wrote furiously. God was describing the plunder of nations. The Babylonians were gathering debt, not wealth. They were piling up stolen goods that would eventually crush them. "Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder you," the voice decreed. Habakkuk looked up from his scroll. The sun had broken the horizon. He saw the logic of divine justice now. It was a circle. Babylon would be used to judge Judah, but Babylon's own violence would eventually be the cause of its own destruction. Evil was self-cannibalizing. It would eat until it burst. "Woe to him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high." The voice was relentless. It condemned the empire builders who thought they could build security on the blood of others. It condemned those who built towns with bloodshed and established cities by iniquity. Habakkuk felt a strange sensation. It was joy, not happiness. Circumstances were still dire, but a deep, resonant joy. God was in control. The chaos was not chaos. It was a complex tapestry of justice that was too big for a human mind to see all at once. "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." Habakkuk wrote the final line of the stanza, his hand steady. The tower felt solid beneath his feet. The fear of the invasion had not vanished, but it had been placed in perspective. Babylon was just a passing shadow. The glory of the Lord was the ocean that would eventually swallow everything. He rolled up the parchment. He had his orders. He had to go down. He had to take this tablet, this vision, and set it up in the marketplace where he had been rejected. He had to tell the people that while the storm was coming, there was a way to stand within it. Habakkuk stood up and looked north one last time. He did not see the dust of armies yet, but he knew they were there. "Come then," he whispered. "Do your worst. My God is on the throne, and I will live by my faith." He descended the ladder, not as a victim of history, but as a witness to eternity. The prophet was returning to the city, armed with the only weapon that could defeat despair. Habakkuk descended from the watchtower with a speed that defied his exhaustion. He did not go to his home to wash the dust from his skin or to eat bread. he went straight to the quarter of the potters. He found the workshop of a man named Jedaiah, a craftsman who had not bowed the knee to the idols of the court. Jedaiah looked up from his wheel, his hands slick with gray clay, and saw the urgency in the prophet's eyes. "I need a tablet," Habakkuk said, his breath coming in short bursts, large, unfired, so it can be written upon deep and wide, but it must be clay that will harden like iron. Jedaiah did not ask questions. He wiped his hands and retrieved a slab of wet clay, smoothing it onto a wooden frame. He handed Habakkuk a thick iron stylus, the kind used for marking property boundaries. Habakkuk took the tool. The voice of God from the tower still rang in his ears, a command that overrode all fear: write the vision, to make it plain. He carved the letters. He did not write small, intricate script meant for scholars. He carved deeper, jagged strokes that a man could read while running past. He carved the verdict of history before it happened. The just shall live by his faith. He hoisted the heavy wooden frame onto his shoulder. Jedaiah offered to help, but Habakkuk shook his head. This was his burden to carry. He marched toward the Temple Mount. The morning crowds were thickening. Merchants were setting up their stalls, and priests were preparing for the midday sacrifice. When Habakkuk slammed the heavy tablet down onto the stone pavement near the gate of the guard, the sound cracked through the chatter of the marketplace. Heads turned. People stopped. They saw the mad prophet, disheveled and wild, standing next to a sign that proclaimed a riddle. "Read it," Habakkuk shouted, his voice raw. "Read it and run with it, for the vision is for an appointed time." A crowd gathered, forming a cautious circle. They squinted at the large letters. "The just shall live by his faith." It seemed too simple. Where was the promise of victory? Where was the promise of wealth? "What does this mean?" a tanner asked, wiping his hands on his apron. "Does it mean we will defeat the Chaldeans?" "It means the Chaldeans are coming," Habakkuk declared, stepping out from behind the tablet. "It means the soul of the enemy is puffed up and not upright. But you, if you wish to live, you must anchor yourself not in the walls of this city, but in the faithfulness of God." Eliakim pushed through the crowd, followed by a retinue of scribes. He looked at the tablet and then at Habakkuk with a sneer of contempt. "You vandalize the king's pavement with your nonsense," Eliakim spat. "Faith? Faith in what? Faith that you are a fool? Faith that God is not blind," Habakkuk countered, pointing the stylus at Eliakim like a weapon. "God showed me the end of the wicked. He showed me the soul of the conqueror. He is arrogant. He never rests. He enlarges his appetite like the grave and is like death, never satisfied." Eliakim stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You speak of Babylon, but the king has a treaty. If the ambassadors hear you calling their empire death, it will cause an incident." "Let it cause an incident," Habakkuk roared, ensuring the back rows could hear, "because they are not allies. They are executioners, and they gather captive nations like sand. But this tablet," he slapped the wet clay, "this is the promise. When the walls fall, when the gold is stripped, the man who trusts in the Lord will remain standing." "Smash it," Eliakim ordered his guards. 2 soldiers stepped forward, drawing their maces. Habakkuk did not move. He stood between the soldiers and the word of God. "Strike it," Habakkuk challenged them. "Break the clay, but you cannot break the decree. It is written in heaven before it is written on earth. If you silence me, the stones themselves will cry out." The soldiers hesitated. There was a power in Habakkuk's stance that unnerved them. It was not physical strength. It was the terrifying certainty of a man who has seen the future. "Leave it," Eliakim snapped, sensing the mood of the crowd shifting. He did not want to create a martyr today. Let the sun bake his foolishness. When the Egyptians arrive to reinforce us, everyone will see that this prophet was merely a coward. Eliakim turned on his heel and marched away. The soldiers followed. The crowd began to disperse, whispering. They looked at the tablet with unease. The words seemed to vibrate. "The just shall live by his faith." Habakkuk remained by the gate as the clay began to dry in the sun. He watched the faces of the people. Most walked away, choosing the comfort of denial, but a few lingered. Baruch, the scribe, stepped out of the shadows. A young woman who had lost her husband to the war in the north stood nearby. A boy who swept the temple steps stopped to stare. They were the remnant. They were the ones who would need this tablet when the darkness fell. "Baruch," Habakkuk called out softly, The scribe approached, his eyes fixed on the letters. "It is a hard word, Habakkuk. To live by faith means we have nothing else to hold on to." "That is the point," Habakkuk replied, wiping the clay dust from his hands. "Everything else is about to be taken away." Night had fallen, and the tablet stood like a silent sentinel at the gate, hardening under the moon. Habakkuk, however, had moved to the house of Shaphan, the elder. The windows were shuttered tight, and a single oil lamp illuminated the faces of the 12 men gathered there. This was the war council of the faithful. They were not planning a rebellion against the king, nor a defense against Babylon. They were planning the survival of their souls. Habakkuk stood at the head of the table. He looked different now. The frantic energy of the watchtower was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. God had given him a song, a taunt to sing over the enemy, and he needed to teach it to them. "You fear the Chaldeans," Habakkuk began, his voice low and steady. "You fear their chariots and their spears, but God showed me their end before they have even begun." He leaned forward, his hands resting on the wooden table. 5 woes. God pronounced 5 curses upon them, and not just upon them, but upon any man who builds his life on violence, even our own king. The men exchanged nervous glances. To speak against the king's methods in private was treason. "Woe to him who increases what is not his," Habakkuk announced the first woe. "How long? Woe to him who loads himself with pledges." "Explain," Shaphan whispered. "Babylon is a debtor," Habakkuk said. "They conquer nations and steal their gold, but they are only piling up debt. They think they are rich, but they are borrowing wrath. Suddenly, their debtors will rise up. They will wake up and make them tremble. Because they have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder them." He looked at the men. "Do not envy their power. It is a loan that will be called in with blood." He paced to the other side of the room. "Woe to him who covets evil gain for his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of disaster." Baruch nodded slowly, like the eagle. "Yes," Habakkuk agreed. "They think if they build high enough walls, if they hoard enough gold, they will be safe from death, but they have consulted shame for their own house. By cutting off many peoples, they have sinned against their own soul." Habakkuk's voice grew harder. "For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the timbers will answer it." The image struck them. The very stones of their fortresses, built on the backs of slaves and the blood of the innocent, would testify against them. There was no security in a house built on crime. "Woe to him who builds a town with bloodshed, who establishes a city by iniquity." The room went deadly silent. Everyone knew that King Jehoiakim had expanded his palace using forced labor, refusing to pay wages, working men to death to widen his windows and panel his rooms with cedar. Habakkuk was not just condemning Babylon, he was condemning the leadership of Judah. "Is it not from the Lord of hosts," Habakkuk asked, "that the peoples labor for the fire and nations weary themselves for nothing?" "For the fire," Shaphan repeated. "Everything they build is fuel." "Exactly," Habakkuk said. "We worry about saving the city. God says the city is already kindling. But the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That is the only thing that lasts." He moved to the 4th woe, his voice trembling with disgust. "Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor, pressing him to the bottle, even to make him drunk, that he may look on his nakedness." He described the humiliation Babylon inflicted on conquered kings, stripping them of dignity, shaming them for sport. "You are filled with shame instead of glory," Habakkuk declared. "The cup of the Lord's right hand will be turned against you, and utter shame will be on your glory." He paused, looking at the small clay idols that stood on a shelf in the corner of the room, household gods that even Shaphan's servants had not fully discarded. "And the final woe," Habakkuk whispered, walking toward the shelf. He picked up the idol, a small figure of wood covered in silver leaf. "Woe to him who says to wood, 'Awake,' and to silent stone, 'Arise.'" He held the idol up to the lamplight. "Can this teach? Look, it is overlaid with gold and silver, yet in it there is no breath at all." He crushed the idol in his hand, the dry wood snapping with a sharp crack. He dropped the pieces onto the table. "The Babylonian trusts in his sword. The king trusts in his walls. The people trust in these trinkets. They are all silent. They are all dead." Habakkuk looked around the room, his eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying hope. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. The men sat in the stillness of that statement. The panic that had gripped them for weeks began to dissolve. The armies were coming, yes. The destruction was inevitable, yes. But the Babylonians were already dead men walking. Their power was a trap. Their wealth was a weight. Their gods were lies. Habakkuk sat down, the tension leaving his shoulders. We do not need to fight them, he told the remnant. And we do not need to fear them. We only need to outlast them. We live by faith. We watch the fire burn the chaff, and we stand on the floor that cannot be shaken. A heavy knock at the door shattered the silence. Shaphan signaled for silence. He moved to the door and peered through the slat. He turned back to the group, his face pale. It is the royal guard, Shaphan whispered. They are searching houses for sedition. Habakkuk stood up. He did not run. He remembered the vision. Though it tarry, wait for it. Open the door, Habakkuk said calmly. We have nothing to hide. We are the only ones in this city who are truly free. The door to Shaphan's house flew open, but the royal guards did not rush in with swords drawn to arrest the conspirators. Instead, the captain of the guard stumbled over the threshold, his face drained of blood, his helmet askew. He looked not at the men gathered around the table, but through them, his eyes wide with a terror that stripped him of his rank. The beacons, the captain gasped, bracing himself against the doorframe. The beacons at Lachish are out. The room went cold. Shaphan stood up, knocking over his chair. Out, you mean they have signaled? I mean they are dark, the captain whispered. A rider just came through the dung gate. The Babylonians are not at the border. They are here. Azekah has fallen. Lachish is surrounded. They moved faster than the wind. Habakkuk felt the blood leave his extremities. The prophecy was no longer ink on a tablet. It was a physical blow. He felt a sudden, violent trembling in his stomach, a visceral reaction that he could not control. His lips quivered. It was the sensation of rottenness entering his bones. Eliakim, the corrupt official who had mocked Habakkuk in the marketplace, pushed past the captain, entering the house uninvited. He was no longer the arrogant courtier. He was a man whose world had just evaporated. Prophet, Eliakim screamed, grabbing Habakkuk by the tunic. You said this. You called them. Make it stop. Pray to your God and make them turn back. Habakkuk pulled Eliakim's hands away. I did not call them, Eliakim. I only saw them coming, and you cannot stop a flood by shouting at the water. We have the treaty, Eliakim babbled, pacing the room frantically. The Egyptians. The Pharaoh promised. The Pharaoh is a broken staff, Habakkuk said, his voice shaking not with fear of Eliakim, but with the sheer magnitude of the divine presence pressing down on the city. When you lean on him, he pierces your hand. There is no help coming from the south. The storm comes from the north. Outside, a scream tore through the night. Then another. The news was spreading. The illusion of safety, spun by Hananiah and the court prophets, was shattering. The sound of the city changed instantly from the hum of sleep to the roar of panic. The captain of the guard looked at Habakkuk. What do we do? We cannot fight them. They eat nations. Habakkuk looked at the remnant gathered around the table. They were terrified. The intellectual understanding of the 5 woes was one thing. Hearing the war drums was another. We do not run, Habakkuk said, forcing his legs to stop shaking. We stand. We have entered the day of trouble. I must wait quietly for the day of distress to come upon the people who invade us. Quietly, Eliakim shouted, his eyes bulging. They will butcher us. They will peel the skin from our bodies. How can you speak of quiet? Because their judgment is also written, Habakkuk replied, locking eyes with the terrified official. But for now, we must endure the winnowing. The wheat is separated from the chaff not by a gentle breeze, but by violence. Shaphan moved to the window and looked out. They are closing the city gates. The siege has begun. Habakkuk felt the weight of the moment crush down on him. He had asked for justice. He had asked for God to intervene. Now, God was walking through the land in indignation, thrashing the nations in anger. The reality of it made Habakkuk want to vomit. It was too big, too terrible for a human mind to hold. He turned to the group. Gather your families. Bring them here. We will not spend this night in hysteria. We will spend it recalling who holds the storm. The siege tightened like a noose. For weeks, the sound of battering rams echoing against the outer walls became the heartbeat of Jerusalem. Food was rationed. The water in the cisterns grew low. The streets were filled with the hollow-eyed stare of starvation. In the cellar of Shaphan's house, Habakkuk sat with the remnant. The air was thick with despair. They could hear the screams from the walls where the defenders were dying. The silence of God had returned, but now it was the silence of the executioner raising the axe. Baruch, the scribe, sat in the corner, his head in his hands. "Where is the mercy?" he whispered. "You spoke of faith, Habakkuk, but faith does not put bread in my son's mouth. Faith does not stop the arrows." Habakkuk stood up. He grabbed a lyre that hung on the wall. It was untuned, dusty. He struck a chord, a jarring, dissonant sound that cut through the weeping in the room. "We do not sing of bread tonight," Habakkuk announced. His voice was raspy from thirst, but it held a strange, wild power. "We sing a shigionoth." "A dirge?" Shaphan asked. "No," Habakkuk said. "A wild song. A song of reeling emotions. We must remember. If we forget now, we die before the walls are breached." He began to play, striking the strings with force. He did not sing a gentle melody. He chanted, his voice rising in a rhythmic shout. "God came from Teman," Habakkuk cried out, "the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise." He looked at the frightened faces. "Do you remember when we were slaves? When we were nothing?" He stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations. "That was long ago," Baruch argued, looking up. "That was Moses. This is now. It is the same God," Habakkuk shouted, pacing the small room, the lyre clutched in his hand like a weapon. "Was the Lord displeased against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea, that you rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation?" He was forcing them to look back. He was dragging their minds away from the Babylonian ramps and back to the Red Sea. He was painting a picture of a God who was a warrior, not a passive observer. "The mountains saw you and trembled," Habakkuk sang, the sweat pouring down his face. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered its voice and lifted its hands on high. The energy in the room began to shift. The men sat up. The women stopped rocking their children. The sheer violence of the imagery was matching the violence of their reality. "The sun and moon stood still in their habitation," Habakkuk roared. "At the light of your arrows they went, at the shining of your glittering spear." He turned to Eliakim, who was huddled in the corner, a shadow of his former self. "You fear the Chaldean spear? My God walks through the sea with his horses. He marches through the land in indignation. He threshes the nations in anger. Then why does he not save us?" Eliakim wailed. "He is saving us," Habakkuk countered, striking the lyre so hard a string snapped. "He went forth for the salvation of his people. He wounded the head out of the house of the wicked. He is dismantling the pride of man. Eliakim, he is stripping us of everything that is not him." Habakkuk fell to his knees, his chest heaving. The terror was still there, but it had been transmuted. It was no longer the terror of a victim. It was the awe of a witness. He had seen the march of God through history, and he realized that Babylon was just a pebble on the road. "I heard," Habakkuk whispered into the silence of the room, and my body trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered my bones, and I trembled in myself, that I might rest in the day of trouble. He looked at Baruch. "We tremble, but we rest, because we know the ending. The Babylonians devour the poor secretly, like a lion in his den, but God walks on the high places." Baruch stood up slowly. He wiped the tears from his face. "Play it again," he said softly. "Play the song of the warrior." The siege dragged on. The unthinkable happened. The supply lines were completely cut. The fields outside the walls, once lush with the autumn harvest, had been burned by the Babylonians. The olive groves were cut down to build siege engines. The vineyards were trampled into mud. Habakkuk walked the perimeter of the inner wall, looking out through a narrow arrow slit. Beside him stood an old farmer named Kish, who had fled into the city when the army arrived. Kish stared out at the blackened wasteland that used to be his farm. Gone. Kish muttered. 3 generations of fig trees. My grandfather planted them, the vines, torn up by the roots, the sheep, slaughtered to feed the pagans. Kish turned to Habakkuk, his eyes hollow with hunger and rage. Where is the blessing, prophet? You speak of the just living by faith. Look at that. The fig tree does not blossom. There is no fruit on the vines. The labor of the olive has failed. The fields yield no food. The flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no herd in the stalls. He grabbed Habakkuk's arm. If God is with us, why are we starving? If God is good, why is his land barren? We have nothing. We are destitute. Habakkuk looked at the devastation. It was absolute. Every tangible sign of God's covenant favor, the land, the crops, the prosperity had been erased. This was the ultimate test. It was easy to worship Yahweh when the barns were full. It was easy to trust when the olive press was overflowing. But now the altar was empty. You are right, Kish, Habakkuk said quietly. The fig tree does not blossom. So we curse him? Kish asked, his voice bitter. We curse the day we were born and die? No, Habakkuk said. He felt a strange lightness in his chest, a defiance that defied logic. We rejoice. Kish stared at him as if he were insane. Rejoice? In what? In death? In the God of my salvation, Habakkuk said. The words came from a depth he didn't know he possessed. The joy is not in the figs, Kish. The joy is not in the olives. Those things were gifts, but they were not the giver. Habakkuk climbed up onto a pile of rubble so he could see the faces of the soldiers slumping against the wall. They were weak, starving, hopeless. Listen to me, Habakkuk shouted to them. Though the fig tree does not blossom, though there be no fruit on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, though the fields yield no food, though the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. He paused, letting the reality of their loss hang in the air. Yet, Habakkuk cried, the word ringing like a bell, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. It was a declaration of independence from circumstance. Babylon could take the grain. They could take the wine. They could take the oil. But they could not take the joy of the Lord, because that joy was not produced by the earth. It was poured down from heaven. Kish looked up at the prophet. The bitterness in his face began to crack. He saw a man who had lost everything but possessed something untouchable. The Lord God is my strength, Habakkuk declared, his voice steady and strong. He will make my feet like deer's feet. He will make me walk on my high places. High places? Kish whispered. We are in a pit. No, Habakkuk smiled, a genuine smile amidst the smoke and ruin. The pit is where they think we are, but our spirits are running on the mountaintops. Babylon cannot touch us there. They can kill the body, Kish, but they cannot chain the song. Kish slumped against the wall, but for the first time in weeks, he did not look like a dead man. He looked like a man waking up. He looked at his empty hands, and then he looked up at the sky. The end was imminent. The walls were breaching. The sound of the enemy was no longer a distant rumble, but a clamor at the gates. The time for writing was over. The time for waiting was done. Habakkuk sat in the archive chamber with Baruch and the chief musician of the temple, a man named Asaph. The room was dim, illuminated by a single dying lamp. On the table lay the finished scroll. It contained the complaints, the answers, the vision of the tablet, and the final prayer of the warrior god. It is finished, Habakkuk said, rolling the parchment and tying it with a leather cord. He handed the scroll to Asaph. To the chief musician, Habakkuk said formally, with my stringed instruments. Asaph took the scroll with trembling hands. We may not survive the night, Habakkuk. The Babylonians will burn the archives. This scroll, it will be ash. No, Habakkuk said with absolute certainty. Babylon burns wood and stone. They cannot burn the word. This scroll will outlive Nebuchadnezzar. It will outlive his empire. It will be read when Babylon is nothing but a mound of dust in the desert. He stood up and walked to the door of the chamber. The noise of the battle was deafening now. Where are you going? Baruch asked, standing up. To the high place, Habakkuk said. The tower, Baruch asked. It is a target, you will be killed. I do not mean the stone tower, Habakkuk replied. I mean the spiritual posture. I have wrestled, Baruch. I have questioned. I have wept. And now, I trust. He turned to face them one last time. The just shall live by his faith. Do not forget it. When they drag you away in chains, when you sit by the rivers of Babylon and weep, remember this moment. Remember that God is not absent. He is merely silent because he is working a work you would not believe. Habakkuk stepped out into the chaotic courtyard. Smoke billowed from the lower city. Arrows rained down like black hail. But Habakkuk moved with the agility of a young stag. He navigated the debris, the screaming crowds, the rushing soldiers. He did not look down at the blood. He looked up. He felt the strength of the Lord entering his legs, not a strength to fight with a sword, but a strength to endure, to rise, to transcend. He felt his feet becoming like hinds' feet, sure-footed, able to leap over the crags of suffering without slipping into despair. He climbed the stairs to the highest point of the city wall, ignoring the shouts of the commanders. He stood there, silhouetted against the burning skyline. Below him, the Chaldeans swarmed like locusts, their iron chariots grinding the earth. They were terrifying. They were death incarnate. But Habakkuk began to sing. He sang the Shigionoth. He sang of the God who rides the clouds. He sang of the joy that persists when the fig tree fails. A Babylonian archer below spotted the lone figure on the wall. He drew his bow. The arrow flew, a dark line cutting through the orange glow of the fires. But Habakkuk did not flinch. He did not stop singing. He had found his answer. The world was broken. Yes. Justice was perverted. Yes. But the Lord was in his holy temple. And as the arrow flew, Habakkuk knew that whether he lived or died in the next heartbeat, he had already won. He was walking on the high places, and nothing in Babylon could pull him down. The scroll remained in Asaph's hands, safe in the jar, ready for the generations to come. The song continued, carried by the wind, rising above the smoke, an eternal testimony that even in the darkest night, the righteous do not just survive. They fly.